There are cases in my chronicles of Sherlock Holmes so steeped in dread and whispered superstition that I hesitated long before setting them down. For even the most rational mind can falter when the shadow of the infernal is said to fall upon a house. It was in the waning days of autumn, when the Thames lay dark beneath a pall of smoke, that Holmes and I were summoned, not by the hand of law or crown, but by a widow haunted by visitations too dreadful to name, a veil that poisoned, a portrait that watched, and a household that trembled beneath the name given to her by the fearful, the Devil's Widow. What followed carried us from the lamplit streets of London to a manor on the moor, where fear itself was fashioned into a weapon, and where Holmes would pit cold reason against the spectre of damnation. This, then, is the case I record as Sherlock Holmes and the Devil's Widow. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. The Letter with the Bitter Scent. The autumn of 1891 had settled upon London with that peculiar melancholy which characterizes the dying year in our great metropolis. The morning had dawned thin and grey, as if some celestial artist had sketched our city in charcoal rather than rendered it in oils, and the fog pressed against the windows of our Baker Street lodgings with an almost sentient persistence. I had risen early, my old Afghan wound troubling me with the damp, and found Holmes already positioned in his customary chair, surrounded by a chaos of newspapers and tobacco ash, his long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin in that attitude of contemplation I had come to know so well. The criminal intelligence of London appears to have taken a holiday, Watson, he remarked, without turning his head. 3 days without a case of any distinction. I shall shortly be reduced to studying the migratory patterns of the common house fly for want of occupation. I was framing some reply, likely something about the virtues of rest, which invariably fell upon deaf ears, when Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread sounded upon the stair. She entered with that brisk efficiency which marked her character, bearing a card upon her silver tray. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. A clergyman, by his dress. He seems most agitated." "Then show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson. An agitated clergyman promises far more interest than these tedious accounts of petty larceny." Our visitor proved to be a narrow man of ecclesiastical cut, somewhere past 50 years of age, with bone-white fingers that clutched at his hat-brim, and a collar so tight it seemed designed to contain rather than comfort. His face bore that pinched quality one sometimes observes in those who have spent too many years contemplating sin, and not enough considering grace. He bowed nervously as he entered, his eyes darting about our sitting-room as if expecting some manifestation of the exotic or arcane. "Reverend Silas Peck," he announced, his voice reedy, but carrying that peculiar resonance acquired through years of pulpit oratory. He looked past me to the figure lounging with seeming indolence in the armchair. "I am told that Mr. Sherlock Holmes does not fear the devil." Holmes's lips curved in that thin smile which indicated his interest had been piqued. "My fear, Reverend Peck, is reserved for those who presume to act in the devil's stead. The supernatural has yet to present me with a case that could not be reduced to the very natural indeed. Pray sit, and my friend Dr. Watson will take notes while you unburr yourself of whatever spectre has driven you to our door on so grey a morning." I drew my chair closer and produced my notebook, that faithful companion of so many strange adventures. The Reverend settled himself upon the edge of our sofa with the air of a man prepared to flee at the first provocation, and from within his coat he produced a letter. Even from my position I could observe its curious state. The edges were singed brown, and there hung about it a faint, unlikely perfume that seemed at odds with its scorched appearance. "This letter," Peck began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "was thrust beneath the door of my vicarage 3 nights past, at Ashwood in Devonshire, a village that sits upon the very edge of the Dartmoor wastes. It comes from Lady Eveline Ashcroft, widow of the late Sir Jasper Ashcroft. I knew I must bring it to London, to one who might look upon such matters with eyes unclouded by superstition," Holmes supplied helpfully. "Do go on." The Reverend's Adam's apple bobbed above his tight collar. "Sir Jasper died but a month since. The physician, a sound man, Dr. Cartwright, most respected, declared it a natural death. His heart, they said. He had been in declining health for some months, but since his passing, there have been occurrences at Ashwood Manor, things that defy rational explanation, Mr. Holmes." Holmes had taken the letter and was holding it up to the morning light that struggled through our windows, his keen eyes narrowing. He brought it to his nose and inhaled delicately, then smiled, a smile I had learned to recognize as that of the hawk sighting its prey. "Prussic acid," he murmured. "How very interesting. Do continue, Reverend." Peck's face had gone even whiter, if such a thing were possible. I do not understand, sir. The perfume man, almond, yes, but with that acrid undertone that speaks of hydrocyanic acid, prussic acid, as it is commonly known. But pray, tell me of these occurrences that have so disturbed Lady Eveline, and driven her to seek aid through ecclesiastical channels." The Reverend leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper now, as if the very walls might carry tales. "They call her the Devil's Widow, Mr. Holmes. It is a cruel appellation, born of village gossip and ancient superstition, but it has taken root. Sir Jasper made his fortune in iron. His furnaces, they say, made many a fog-bank blush red with their infernal glow. He was a hard man, Mr. Holmes, and not beloved. And now—" He paused, visibly steadying himself. "Now there are hoof marks upon the south terrace, cloven marks, Mr. Holmes, such as one might imagine upon an ungodly visitor. A room in the east wing was found scorched within, though the grate was cold and no fire had been lit. And 3 nights ago, Lady Eveline's maid swears she saw a hand, a glowing hand, pressed against the window-pane of the red chamber, though no living soul stood without." Holmes had risen now and was pacing before the fireplace, with that restless energy that always seized him when a problem presented itself. Fascinating. And Lady Eveline herself, how does she bear these manifestations? She is near collapse, sir. A woman of good sense and strong character, or so I had always believed. But these events have shaken her profoundly. She fears for her sanity, Mr. Holmes. She fears that she is being haunted by her husband's spirit, Holmes supplied, or by something darker still. "Just so, sir." Holmes turned and fixed our visitor with that penetrating gaze that seemed to read the very soul. "Tell me, Reverend, who stands to benefit should Lady Eveline's nerves fail entirely? Who inherits if she should be driven mad or worse?" Peck's hands twisted in his lap. "There is Mr. Orrin Vale, the family solicitor. He has been much about the house, attending to the estate's affairs. Then there is Mr. Lionel Ashcroft, the late baronet's younger brother, who would inherit should Lady Eveline, should anything befall her. And Miss Clara Whitfield, the lady's companion and ward, though she seems devoted to her mistress. Quite a household, Holmes observed, returning to his chair. He took up the letter once more and examined the singed edges with minute attention. This scorching, Watson, observe the pattern. Not the random charring of accident, but the deliberate mark of a lucifer match, applied with intention. And this perfume. He held the letter toward me. Your medical training, my dear fellow. What do you make of it? I took the paper and subjected it to as careful an examination as my less practiced eye could manage. The almond scent was indeed present, but underlying it was something else, something that brought to mind the chemical laboratory and substances best handled with caution. Prussic acid, as you said. But why would anyone? Why indeed? Holmes sprang to his feet with sudden decision. Watson, pack your bag. I believe a little country air and honest village superstition will do our London lungs considerable good. Reverend Peck, you will return to Devonshire immediately and inform Lady Eveline that she may expect us this evening. She is to alter nothing. No cleaning of scorched walls, no obliteration of hoofprints. The stage must remain as the players have set it. Within the hour we were rattling through the London streets in a hansom, bound for Paddington Station. Holmes said little during the journey, content to gaze out at the passing scene with that abstracted air that told me his mind was already racing ahead, sifting facts, constructing theories, demolishing them and building anew. I had learned long ago not to interrupt these silences, for they were as much a part of his method as the examination of physical evidence. It was close upon noon when our train bore us toward the west, the great city unspooling behind us like yards of sooty ribbon, gradually giving way to the green of the countryside. Holmes broke his silence only once as we crossed the first open stretches of moorland, their purple heather rolling away to distant tors. "Devils, Watson," he remarked, his eyes still fixed upon the passing landscape. "Seldom wear iron nails upon their shoes, and when they do, they invariably squeak. Remember that, my dear fellow, when we are confronted with the supernatural at Ashwood Manor. The supernatural is merely the natural not yet understood, or the natural deliberately disguised." By eventide we reached Ashwood village, a cluster of stone cottages huddled against the moor as if for protection from its vast indifference. A carriage had been sent to convey us the final mile to the manor, and as we approached, I felt that familiar stirring of unease that accompanies entry into the unknown. Ashwood Manor rose before us, a long, low house of lichened stone, its mullioned windows brooding over a lawn made raw and sere by the autumn winds. There was something melancholy about the place, something that spoke of isolation and secrets kept too long. We were received in a parlour walled with books, legal tomes and works of divinity, I noted, and dominated by a single dreadful portrait. It showed a woman in widow's weeds, her face partially obscured by a black veil that hung like a raven's wing. The painting bore a small brass plaque, "The Devil's Widow." I felt a chill at the sight of it, though whether from the image itself or the cruel jest it represented, I could not say. Lady Eveline Ashcroft rose to meet us. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, handsome rather than beautiful, with that carriage of dignity that comes from good breeding and strong character. Yet I could see at once the marks of recent suffering, the shadows beneath her eyes, the tremor in her hands as she clasped them before her, the brittleness in her voice when she spoke. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you cannot know what relief your presence brings. I'm not a fanciful woman, gentlemen. I have never credited tales of spirits or supernatural vengeance. But what has occurred here? Her voice faltered. If I am mad, I beg you to tell me so plainly. If I am not, then I am in mortal danger, and I know not from what quarter it comes. Holmes bowed over her hand with an uncharacteristic gentleness I had seen him display only rarely, and only toward those he judged worthy of his protection. Madam, you shall sleep soundly tonight, and you shall not dream of cloven feet or vengeful shades. That much I promise you. Now, with your permission, Dr. Watson and I should like to examine these manifestations while daylight remains. She nodded, seeming to draw strength from his certainty. I have given orders that nothing be touched. Mr. Vale thought it foolish to preserve these marks, but I insisted. Mr. Vale has his opinion, and we have ours, Holmes replied smoothly. Now, if you will show us to the south terrace. Thus we came, as the autumn dusk began to gather, and the wind mourned about the eaves, into that household where fear walked barefoot through the corridors. I confess I felt the old prickle between my shoulders, that primitive warning that tells a man he has stepped from the realm of reason into something older and darker. Yet I also observed the familiar signs of Holmes's quickening interest, the flare of his nostrils as if scenting a promise upon the air, the keen light in his grey eyes, the coiled energy in his spare frame. It was promise enough for me. Where Sherlock Holmes went, there truth would eventually stand revealed, stripped of its theatrical costume and shown for what it truly was. And so the case began, under a sky that had forgotten the sun, in a house where even the clocks seemed to tick more softly than they ought, as if time itself conspired to keep whatever secrets lay hidden within those ancient stones. Chapter 2. Prince by Moonlight and a Vale supper at Ashwood Manor was, I must confess, one of the most uncomfortable meals I have ever endured. The dining room was panelled in dark oak that seemed to swallow the candlelight rather than reflect it, and the faces gathered about the table wore expressions ranging from poorly concealed hostility to barely suppressed anxiety. Mr. Orrin Vale presided over the meal with the assured manner of one who had long made himself indispensable to the household. He was a man of middle years, with an elegant stoop that suggested hours spent poring over legal documents, and a voice like well-oiled hinges, smooth, measured, and somehow faintly unpleasant. He inquired after our journey with that discourteous courtesy by which certain legal minds contrive to demonstrate their superiority while observing all the forms of politeness. Lionel Ashcroft, seated at the far end of the table, presented a stark contrast to Vale's polished manner. The late baronet's younger brother was a man of perhaps 45, with the loose-fleshed, mottled complexion of one who keeps too intimate company with the bottle. He drank his claret with ill grace and spoke chiefly of horses, directing his remarks to no one in particular, and interrupting others with the casual rudeness of one born to privilege, but not to refinement. Miss Clara Whitfield, Lady Eveline's companion, sat close to her mistress and tended her plate with the devotion of an acolyte maintaining an altar. She was a pale creature of perhaps 30 years, plainly dressed and possessed of honest grey eyes that seemed perpetually worried. She spoke little, but I observed how her gaze followed Lady Eveline's every movement, and how her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the water pitcher. Holmes, employing that most innocuous of his many humours, begged leave after the meal to examine the manifestations that had so disturbed the household. This request was granted with alacrity by all save Mr. Vale, whose thin lips twitched in what might have been amusement or contempt. I could not determine which. "By all means, Mr. Holmes," Vale said, dabbing his mouth with his napkin, "though I confess I am sceptical that you will find anything beyond the overwrought imaginings of simple servants. Still, Lady Eveline will rest easier once you have satisfied yourself, and that is what we all desire." The words were proper, but I detected in his tone a note of mockery that set my teeth on edge. Holmes, however, merely smiled his thin smile and rose from the table. We began our investigation upon the south terrace, where the infamous hoofprints had been observed. The moon had risen, swollen and low, casting that peculiar light which reveals more than the bright sun ever does. Shadows become solid, textures spring into relief, and the world takes on an air of heightened reality bordering upon the unnatural. Holmes immediately went down upon his knees, heedless of the damage to his trousers, and produced from his pockets that collection of investigative tools I had come to recognize: a powerful lens, a stub of candle, a folding rule, and a small envelope for collecting samples. He spent several minutes in silent examination, moving about on all fours like some lean hunting hound, pausing now and then to hold his candle close to the turf. "Watson," he called at length, and I perceived the note of satisfaction in his voice. "Come and observe your devil." I knelt beside him, and he directed my attention to one of the prints. In the moonlight, I could clearly see the cloven impression. It did indeed suggest the hoof of some beast, and the superstitious villager might well have made of it proof of infernal visitation. "Now, look more closely," Holmes instructed, holding his lens so that I might see through it. "What do you observe about the depth and spacing?" I examined the mark as carefully as I could. "The stride seems remarkably regular, and the depth appears uniform, as if produced by a boot with an artificial attachment," Holmes completed. "Quite so. This is no cloven hoof, Watson, but a donkey shoe riveted to a human boot. The farrier's work is indifferent. Observe how the nail heads protrude slightly unevenly. And note here," he indicated the right-hand prints, "how the weight distribution favours the left side. Your infernal visitor, my dear fellow, has a weak right knee, and compensates by leaning to his left when he walks." He moved his candle to the edge of the terrace, where it met the stone. "And here, do you see? Lamp-black, smudged upon the turf where the hoof grazed the edge. Our devil is a messy artist, Watson. He has left his signature in soot." From the terrace, we passed into the house and up to the Red Chamber, so called, I learned, because of its crimson damask wallpaper and furnishings. It was here that the mysterious scorching had been observed. The room appeared normal enough at first glance, a bedchamber of modest size, well appointed if somewhat old-fashioned, with a cheerful fire laid ready but unlit in the grate. Yet upon closer examination, one could indeed see a peculiar halo of smoke damage surrounding the brass door latch, though the grate itself lay prim with cold ash that bore no sign of recent disturbance. Holmes took his candle to the latch and bent close, his sharp features thrown into dramatic relief by the flame. He produced a small glass vial from his pocket and, using the edge of his penknife, carefully scraped something from the brass into it. He held it up to the light, then passed it to me. "Phosphorus, Watson. Observe the faint straw-coloured bloom. A match head, rubbed upon the latch and ignited from without, could produce a very pretty, ghostly glow, sufficient to convince a frightened servant that some supernatural hand had left its mark." He moved to the window and examined the sill with minute attention. And here, scratches in the paint, quite fresh. A wire was drawn through from outside, likely heated in a spirit lamp, and applied to the latch. The operator would have needed to work in gloves and would likely have suffered some discomfort from the fumes. Not very diabolical, Watson, merely industrious and moderately clever. But to what end? I asked, though I was beginning to perceive the outline of Holmes's thinking. To the end that a woman already shaken by grief, a woman alone in this isolated house with questionable companions, may be driven from reason and from her home. The motive is thoroughly earthly, my friend. The methods are penny theatre, but they have proved effective upon their intended audience. Before we concluded our examination, Holmes made one more request of Lady Eveline, one that brought a flush to her pale cheeks. He asked permission to inspect her wardrobe, specifically any veils or mourning articles that had recently been in use. Miss Whitfield, with evident reluctance, produced a morocco case from Lady Eveline's chamber. Within lay a widow's veil of unusual fineness, its black silk worked with a delicate pattern of jet beading. Holmes lifted it by one corner with the utmost care, holding it away from his face, and closed his eyes in concentration. "Almond," he said quietly. "Not perfume, Watson, but the ghost of bitter pits. And see here, the faintest dusting of blue about the hem, where the fabric would brush against the lips during wear." He folded the veil with meticulous care and replaced it in its case. "This garment must not be worn again, Lady Eveline. Indeed, it should be destroyed, and the ashes scattered." Lady Eveline's hand went to her throat. "What harm can a veil do, Mr. Holmes? I have worn it twice since my husband's death, once to the funeral, and again when I visited his grave a fortnight past." "And did you feel unwell upon either occasion? Light-headed, perhaps? A constriction in the chest?" She considered, her brow furrowing. Yes, I attributed it to grief, to the tightness of my stays, to anything but the truth," Holmes interrupted gently. "This veil has been treated, madam, with a solution sufficiently dilute that a single wearing would produce nothing more than mild distress. But repeated exposure, particularly in the warmth of a closed room, might well prove fatal. You have been the target of a particularly ingenious and cowardly attempt upon your life." The colour drained from Lady Eveline's face, and she swayed. Miss Whitfield caught her arm, and I hastened to assist, helping the lady to a chair. The companion's face had gone as white as her mistress's, but there was something else in her expression. A dawning horror mixed with anger. "Who would do such a thing?" Miss Whitfield demanded, her voice shaking. "Who in this house?" "That, Miss Whitfield, is precisely what we intend to discover," Holmes assured her. "But first, there is one more location I must examine." We descended to the ground floor and entered the late Sir Jasper's study, a comfortable, masculine room lined with books on engineering and industry, its walls decorated with framed certificates and photographs of iron foundries. Upon a side table stood a crystal decanter, half filled with a tawny liquid. "Laudanum," Lady Eveline explained. "My husband took it nightly for his heart. Dr. Cartwright prescribed it some months before his death." Holmes approached the decanter with the caution one might show a venomous serpent. He produced a clean glass rod from his case, dipped it in the liquid, withdrew it, and brought it close to his nose. I saw his nostrils flare, and then his expression hardened in that way that told me he had confirmed some dark suspicion. "Watson," he said quietly, "pray make the acquaintance of a ghost far more effectual than any glowing hand. Laudanum is a useful mask, my friend. Its own powerful scent can conceal other odours, but not from a trained nose. A mere drop or two of prussic acid added to a nightly draught, such as this, would stop a heart as neatly as if it had been cut from the chest." Lady Eveline made a sound, half gasp, half sob. Miss Whitfield put her arms around her mistress, and I saw tears spring to the companion's eyes. I took Holmes by the sleeve and drew him aside. "If you are suggesting that Sir Jasper was murdered, I am suggesting nothing, Watson. I am stating it as fact." His voice was very low, his grey eyes hard as stone. "Sir Jasper Ashcroft was poisoned, likely over a period of several nights, by someone with both access to this study and sufficient knowledge of chemistry to understand the masking properties of laudanum. His death was made to appear natural. The physician saw what he expected to see: a man with a failing heart who had succumbed to his condition. But the murderer is in this house, Watson, and he is not finished. The theatrical manifestations serve two purposes: to drive Lady Eveline from her home and property, or failing that, to prepare the ground for her death, which will then be attributed to her overwrought nerves and a heart weakened by fear. We retired to our chambers late, and I confess I slept little that night. The wind hissed in the chimneys and made of the whole great house an instrument for its mournful music. I kept thinking of the veil in its morocco coffin, of the widow who had unknowingly drawn poison against her lips, of the hand that glowed where no hand should be. Yet I found that it was not devils that troubled my rest. It was men, and the cold calculation of human malice. That, I had learned long ago, was far more terrible than any ghost. Chapter 3. Suspects and Sermons. I was awakened the following morning, not by the housemaid's knock, but by the sound of Holmes's return to our shared sitting-room. I emerged from my bedchamber to find him damp, mud-spattered, and eminently cheerful, with a smear of soot across one sharp cheekbone and an odour of stable hay clinging to his clothes. "You have been abroad early," I observed, consulting my watch. It was barely past 7. "Indeed, Watson. I have been communing with the local farrier, a Mr. Reuben Tabb, whose forge lies in the village, a most illuminating conversation." He tossed something onto the bed, a small iron object that I recognized as a donkey shoe. "Mr. Tabb shod a donkey 2 days ago for a gentleman with a pronounced limp. He was paid in sovereigns and sworn to silence, always a provocative combination, don't you think?" Did he describe this gentleman? After some persuasion, and the application of a half-crown to his memory, he recalled that the customer was churchy in the throat. Those were his exact words. Now, Watson, what would you make of such a description? I considered. Someone with the manner of speech of a clergyman or professional man. Formal, precise. Just so. Reverend Peck has lungs like a bellows and a conscience, I judge, too thin to carry the weight of such deception. But churchy in the throat might equally describe a man of law, whose profession requires formal speech and careful diction. Vale? Or possibly Lionel, though I think not. Vale's walking stick bears a fresh nick of precisely the sort a farrier's anvil makes when one leans against it while waiting. Lionel Ashcroft's gait, by contrast, is sound enough. Indeed, I observed him last night, mounting the stairs with the steady if unsteady tread of the habitual drinker. We shall proceed methodically, my friend. Breakfast first, then interviews. The household assembled for breakfast in a morning room that overlooked the gardens. The meal was a silent, uncomfortable affair, each person seeming locked in private thought. Holmes, however, maintained a flow of light conversation that gradually drew responses from our companions. He had a gift for appearing harmless when it suited him, and I watched him deploy it now with the skill of a master angler playing a delicate line. Following breakfast, Holmes requested private interviews with each member of the household. We began with Lionel Ashcroft, who slouched into our sitting room with the air of a man deeply affronted by the demands of morning consciousness. "Well," he demanded, throwing himself into a chair. "What is it you want of me? I've answered Peck's damned questions, I've answered Vale's questions, and now I must answer yours." Holmes, unperturbed by this graceless opening, regarded him mildly. "I wish merely to understand the situation, Mr. Ashcroft. You are your late brother's heir, are you not?" "I am, if she goes." He jerked his thumb in the general direction of Lady Eveline's chambers. "Jasper left everything to his widow, naturally enough. If she dies or goes mad or runs off, then yes, the estate comes to me. That's no secret, Mr. Holmes. Half the county knows it. And you have debts, I understand." Lionel's face darkened. "Who's been talking? Vale? The old crow? Yes, I have debts. I've always had debts. My brother kept me on a damned short tether, gave me an allowance as if I were a schoolboy, and lectured me about responsibility, as if founding iron was some sort of virtue, and enjoying life was sin. You resented him. I resented being treated like a child, yes, but I didn't kill him, if that's what you're sniffing about. Jasper died of his own accord. His heart was rotten. The doctor said so. And I'm no stage player, Mr. Holmes. I drink, I gamble, I keep company my brother would have frowned upon. But I don't creep about in the night painting glowing hands on windows. That's not my style." There was a brutal honesty to the man that was almost refreshing. He rose to leave, then paused at the door. "If you're looking for theatrical types, Mr. Holmes, you might look closer to home. Vale has been running this estate like it's his own for 20 years. My brother trusted him too much, and now he's got his hooks deep in the accounts. That's all I'll say." After he had gone, I turned to Holmes. "Do you believe him?" "I believe he is precisely what he appears to be, a dissolute fool with more vices than virtues, but not, I think, a murderer. He lacks the imagination and the discipline. Our quarry is a more subtle creature, Watson." Our next interview was with Mr. Orrin Vale, who arrived with perfect punctuality and settled himself with the care of a man arranging his thoughts as precisely as his coat-tails. He had the manner of one prepared to be helpful while yielding nothing of substance. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am entirely at your disposal. I confess I find this entire business regrettable. Lady Eveline is a woman of good sense suffering from the natural effects of grief. These manifestations, as you call them, are likely nothing more than servant gossip magnified by isolated country living." Holmes steepled his fingers. "You were Sir Jasper's solicitor for many years, I understand." 20 years, sir. I drew his will, managed his investments, oversaw his property transactions. He was a difficult client. Men of great energy and strong will often are. But I like to think I served him well." "And Lady Eveline? How would you characterize her relationship with her husband?" Vale's expression became carefully neutral. "Dutiful. Sir Jasper was not an easy man to live with, but Lady Eveline conducted herself with propriety. She has been making certain changes since his death, dismissing old retainers, requesting detailed accounting of expenses that had gone unquestioned for years. It has created some tension." "With you?" "I am a professional, Mr. Holmes. I provide the accounting she requests, though I must say some of her questions betray a certain naivety about how large estates are managed. Sir Jasper understood these matters. His widow is learning. And if she should die, or be declared incompetent, the estate would pass to Lionel Ashcroft. It would, and I would continue to manage it, as I have done for 2 decades. The estate itself is quite sound, Mr. Holmes, despite what certain tongues may suggest." There was the faintest edge to his voice now. "Paper may be subject to many things, alteration, forgery, misunderstanding, but not when I hold it. My reputation rests upon accuracy and discretion." After Vale departed, Holmes sat in silence for several minutes, his fingers drumming upon the arm of his chair. "An interesting man, Watson. Note how he anticipated the question about paper and alteration before I raised it. The guilty mind prepares its defences in advance." Our final interview was with Miss Clara Whitfield, whom we found in the morning room with a book upon her knee. A volume of poetry, I noticed, though the pages were uncut. She looked up at our entry with those worried grey eyes, and I saw again that combination of timidity and devotion that seemed to characterize her nature. "Miss Whitfield," Holmes began gently, "you have been companion to Lady Eveline for how long?" 5 years, Mr. Holmes. Since my father died. He was Sir Jasper's cousin, but the family was not close. Lady Eveline took me in when I had nowhere else to turn. She has been more than kind to me. You are devoted to her." "I would do anything for her," Miss Whitfield said simply. "She is the best of women, Mr. Holmes. She does not deserve this cruelty." "Tell me, in your observation, who might wish her harm?" The companion's hands twisted in her lap. "Jack, I hesitate to cast suspicion, but Lady Eveline has made changes, as Mr. Vale said. She discovered certain irregularities in the household accounts, payments to suppliers that seemed excessive, wages for servants who had left years ago, but whose names remained on the books. She confronted Mr. Vale about it, and he was most displeased. He told her she was interfering in matters beyond her understanding." "And how did she respond?" "She insisted on a full audit. She said that she might be a woman and a widow, but she was not a fool. That was 3 weeks ago, Mr. Holmes. A week later, the manifestations began." Holmes leaned forward. "Miss Whitfield, you have been courageous to tell us this. One more question. On the night Sir Jasper died, were you in the house?" She paled. "I was. I heard Lady Eveline cry out and went to her. Sir Jasper was already dead in his chair, the laudanum glass overturned. Dr. Cartwright came within the hour and said his heart had given out at last. We had no reason to think otherwise." After she left, Holmes sprang to his feet and began that restless pacing which indicated his mind was racing toward some conclusion. Or the core. Pattern becomes clear, Watson. Vale has been embezzling from the estate for years. Nothing spectacular, but steady and accumulating. Sir Jasper either never noticed or chose to ignore it. But his widow has proven less complacent. She has demanded an audit that would expose the theft. Vale's solution? First, remove Sir Jasper before any examination of the books could occur. Then, drive the widow away through terror, or failing that, poison her as well. With both dead and the dissolute Lionel in charge, Vale could continue his plundering indefinitely. But Holmes, this is monstrous. It is methodical, Watson, and methodology is something I can trace and counter. That evening, at Reverend Peck's suggestion, prayers were offered in the small chapel that stood among the yews beyond the garden. The entire household attended, along with several servants from the village. The Reverend's sermon was of the fire and brimstone variety, dwelling at length upon the wages of sin and the devil's many snares. His voice rose and fell with practised effect, and I observed several of the maidservants dabbing at their eyes. As the congregation filed out into the gathering dusk, Holmes touched my sleeve and directed my attention to Reverend Peck, who stood at the chapel door, bidding farewell to his flock. Holmes's keen eyes had fixed upon the clergyman's hands as they grasped those of the departing worshippers. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The nails are clean enough, but there, do you see? A line of black worked into the cuticle of the thumb and forefinger." I looked more closely, and indeed perceived what Holmes had noted, a distinct darkening around the nail beds that suggested recent contact with some sooty substance. "Lamp-black," Holmes continued in an undertone. "Our good Reverend has been handling something liberally dusted with soot. Yet I think we may take him for a red herring, Watson. He believes in hell too thoroughly to trouble himself with constructing one. The mind we seek is cooler, more calculating. Peck is merely—" His words were cut short by a cry from the house, a woman's scream of such terror that it sent every person present at running toward the manor. We reached the entrance at a dead run to find Lady Eveline's maid, a sturdy country girl named Mary, standing in the hallway with her apron pressed to her face, sobbing incoherently. "My lady!" she wailed. "The veil!" "Oh, sir," she put it on. "Just for a moment, to try the length," she said, and she fell. We took the stairs 3 at a time, Holmes in the lead, with that lean, lupine speed of his. The blue parlour door stood open, and within we found Lady Eveline, lying upon the Turkish rug, her face drained of all colour, her lips slightly parted, the black veil half fallen across her mouth and chin. Miss Whitfield knelt beside her, frantically loosening her mistress's collar, her own face nearly as white as Lady Eveline's. Holmes swept into the room and tore the veil away with one swift motion, flinging it toward the open window as if it were a living serpent. He dropped to his knees beside Lady Eveline and placed his fingers against her throat, feeling for the pulse. "Watson, cold water, immediately, and open every window in this room." I hastened to obey, seizing a pitcher from the washstand, while Holmes and Miss Whitfield worked to restore Lady Eveline's breathing. I had already wrapped my handkerchief about my nose and mouth, having understood at once the nature of the danger. The almond scent was faint, but perceptible in the confined space. Between the 3 of us, we managed to coax back breath and colour. Lady Eveline's eyelids fluttered, and she drew a deep, shuddering gasp. Holmes had produced his own handkerchief and tied it about his lower face, and I observed that he kept himself positioned between the discarded veil and the patient, as if to shield her from even its proximity. "Gently, madam," he said, his voice muffled by the cloth. "You are safe now. Breathe deeply. That's right. Watson, have you your smelling salts?" I produced them from my medical bag and applied them judiciously. Lady Eveline's eyes opened fully and fixed upon Holmes with an expression of mingled gratitude and dawning comprehension. "The veil," she whispered. "I had forgotten your warning. I only wanted to see if it needed alteration for the memorial service next week. I put it on for just a moment. And then—" her voice broke. "And then you felt the room begin to spin, your chest constrict, a sensation of numbness about the lips," Holmes supplied. "Precisely so. This veil is not a garment, Lady Eveline. It is a weapon, carefully prepared by someone with knowledge of chemistry and access to your private chambers." He rose and approached the veil where it lay, crumpled by the window, using a poker from the fireplace to lift it. Even from my position several feet away, I caught the bitter almond scent more strongly now. Holmes examined it with minute attention, then turned to us with an expression of cold fury. "The inner surface has been brushed with a solution of prussic acid, dilute enough that casual handling would produce no effect. But when drawn close to the face, when warmed by breath and body heat, when pressed against the mouth—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. "Watson, this must be destroyed at once. Have a fire lit in the kitchen grate and burn it there, in the open air. And wear gloves." Miss Whitfield had helped Lady Eveline to a chair, and now the companion spoke, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Who could have done this? Who has access to my lady's chamber?" "That," said Holmes grimly, "is what we shall discover. But the attempt has been made, and it has failed. Our adversary will know this, and he will know that we are aware of his methods. He will be forced to act more directly, more desperately. And desperate men make mistakes, Miss Whitfield. We shall catch him in one." Lady Eveline reached out and took Holmes's hand, a gesture of such trust and gratitude that I saw my friend's austere features soften momentarily. "You have saved my life, Mr. Holmes, twice over, if I understand correctly. First by warning me, and now by your swift action. Madam, I have merely postponed an attack that should never have been made. But I promise you this: before another day passes, the person responsible will be unmasked. You will sleep tonight under guard. Watson and I shall take turns watching your door. Miss Whitfield will remain with you. And tomorrow—" He paused, and I saw that dangerous light kindle in his grey eyes. "Tomorrow we shall set a trap." The household retired early that night, though I doubt any of us truly slept. I took the first watch, positioning myself in a chair outside Lady Eveline's chamber, with my service revolver loaded and close to hand. The house made its customary nocturnal sounds, the settling of old timbers, the whisper of wind in the chimneys, the distant hoot of an owl from the grounds. But beneath these familiar noises, I seemed to hear something else, a quality of waiting, of tension drawn tight as a wire. Holmes relieved me at 2:00, and I retired to our sitting-room for a few hours of uneasy rest. But sleep, when it came, brought troubled dreams of veils and glowing hands, of poisoned draughts and footprints in the dew, and always the sense that some presence watched from just beyond the edge of vision. Not supernatural, but far more terrible. Human, calculating, and utterly without mercy. I woke before dawn to find Holmes already dressed and pacing the floor with that barely contained energy that told me his plan had crystallized. He turned as I entered, and I saw in his face that fierce joy that came upon him only when the chase approached its climax. "Today, Watson," he said quietly, "today we end this." The autumn morning broke grey and cold, and I knew that before it gave way to evening, all secrets would be laid bare, and all masks torn aside. The devil's widow, I reflected, would finally be free of the very human devils that had sought to destroy her. And Sherlock Holmes, that cold, precise, magnificent intellect, would once again prove that no mystery, however obscured by theatricality and terror, could long withstand the application of reason and observation. The game, as my friend was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, and I did not envy the quarry when the hunter finally closed his hand. Chapter 4. Holmes in Black and the Paper Behind the Portrait. If there was one aspect of my friend's character that never ceased to astonish me, it was his gift for transformation. I had seen Holmes assume a dozen different identities over the course of our association. An aging clergyman, a drunken groom, a common loafer. And each time the metamorphosis was so complete that I myself might have passed him in the street without recognition. It was not merely a matter of costume, though he maintained an extensive wardrobe of disguises in Baker Street. It was rather that he seemed to inhabit each role entirely, adopting the posture, the gait, the very manner of thought appropriate to the character. On the fourth morning of our stay at Ashwood Manor, this talent was deployed with particular effect. At breakfast, Holmes announced his intention to examine the household's heating system, a prosaic enough pursuit that drew barely a glance from the assembled company. He excused himself shortly after the meal and vanished into the servants' quarters. When next I saw him, some hours later, he had been utterly transformed. A house footman in worn livery carried coal to the Red Chamber, moving with the slightly stooped posture of one accustomed to heavy labour. I happened to pass him in the corridor, and would have walked by without a second glance had not those grey eyes flickered toward me with the briefest hint of amusement. It was Holmes, begrimed with coal dust, his hair darkened with soot, his entire bearing altered to that of a working man who had spent his life in service. By noon, this character had evolved into a limping lad who swept the hearths with an indifferent efficiency and whistled, quite badly, various music-hall tunes. I observed him from a distance as he worked his way through the ground-floor rooms, pausing occasionally to exchange words with the housemaids who seemed to accept him as one of their own. Whatever information he sought, he was clearly gathering it through the invisible network of servant gossip that ran through every great house like hidden veins. By twilight he had shed his disguises and returned to our chambers, where he subjected himself to a thorough scrubbing, while I waited with considerable impatience for his report. At length he emerged, his hair still damp, dressed once more in his own clothes, and with that look of satisfaction that told me his day had been productive. "Well, Watson," he said, throwing himself into his chair and accepting the whisky and soda I had poured for him. "Our donkey-shod friend made another appearance last night. He crossed the south lawn shortly after midnight, with no more subtlety than before, I might add, and mounted the terrace. However, seeing the chapel windows lit, Miss Whitfield had gone to pray, it seems. He withdrew, without completing whatever business he had intended. You observed this?" through the window of our sitting room, using the opera glasses, had the foresight to pack. Our nocturnal visitor wears, as I suspected, a gentleman's boot beneath his theatrical hoof detachments. The heel is of a distinctive make. I recognized it as coming from Holborn and Sons of Conduit Street, a London firm whose work I have had occasion to study. They cater to professional men who value quality but not ostentation. That could describe half the gentlemen in England, I objected. True enough, but combined with other observations, it narrows the field considerably. The nails securing the false hoofs are of a particular pattern. One finds them on walking sticks that unscrew, Watson. A gentleman's accessory designed to serve double duty. And Mr. Vale's stick, which I examined yesterday while he was at dinner, is precisely such an implement. The head unscrews to reveal a small compartment, ostensibly for pills or smelling salts, but equally suitable for other small objects. More tellingly, there is a fresh nick in the ferrule, exactly where one might expect if the stick had been leaned against a farrier's anvil while business was conducted. But Vale sat in the front pew during the service last night, I protested. You and I both saw him. Holmes's smile was wolfish. Just so, Watson, which tells us that our friend has an accomplice, or perhaps I should say a hireling. Vale possesses both the motive and the knowledge to orchestrate this campaign of terror, but he has been careful to ensure that he maintains visibility during the more theatrical manifestations. A wise precaution from his perspective. It allows him to feign skepticism while his agent does the actual work. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with that fierce intelligence that marked him at his most formidable. But there is more, Watson. Much more. And I believe it is time we examined the one piece of evidence that has been staring at us since we arrived, that dreadful portrait in the parlour. We waited until the household had retired for their afternoon rest, a country custom that Lady Eveline had maintained despite her distress. Holmes had obtained her permission the previous day to conduct what he termed a thorough examination of the premises, and she had given him carte blanche to investigate as he saw fit. The portrait that dominated the blue parlour seemed even more oppressive in the grey afternoon light. The woman in widow's weeds stared down with an expression that managed to be both accusing and melancholy, and the brass plaque, the Devil's Widow, gleamed dully below the frame. A cruel jest, Holmes murmured, running his fingers along the frame's edge. Commissioned, I learned from the housekeeper, by persons unknown shortly after Sir Jasper's death. It was delivered anonymously, and hung before Lady Eveline even knew of its existence. She came down one morning to find it in place, and the servants assumed she had ordered it herself. A nice touch of psychological warfare, Watson. A daily reminder of how she is, perceived by the world. He produced a thin-bladed knife from his pocket and began to work it carefully between the frame and the wall. Now, help me lift this down. Gently. We don't want to damage whatever may lie behind. Together, we maneuvered the portrait away from the wall. It was heavier than I had expected, and the task required some minutes of careful work. At last we set it aside, and Holmes immediately bent to examine the wall it had concealed. At first glance, there appeared to be nothing unusual, merely the expected plaster, slightly darker where it had been protected from sunlight. But Holmes's keen eyes had detected something my own had missed. He pressed at several points along what appeared to be a continuous surface, and suddenly a section of the plaster swung inward on a concealed hinge. "A priest's hole," Holmes breathed, "or something of that sort. These old houses are full of such contrivances. But this one has been put to rather different use." Within the shallow cavity lay a tin document box of the sort solicitors favour for storing important papers. It was perhaps 12 inches long and 6 wide, painted black, and bearing on its lid a neat label in white paint, V.A. "Vale, Ashcroft," I said. "Precisely." Holmes drew the box out with careful hands and carried it to the writing desk that stood by the window. He produced his magnifying lens and examined the lock closely. "Not forced, but opened regularly. See how the key scratches are fresh and numerous. Whoever uses this hiding place visits it frequently." "Should we open it?" Holmes's smile was thin. "My dear Watson, we have already established that murder has been done in this house, and that further murder is intended. I think we may dispense with the niceties of privacy." He produced from his pocket a set of instruments I had seen him use before. Delicate picks that would have done credit to a professional burglar, and applied himself to the lock. Within 30 seconds, it yielded with a soft click. The contents of the box were precisely what Holmes had anticipated, yet seeing them laid out before us brought home the full scope of Vale's villainy. There were sheaves of memoranda, correspondence between Vale and various London financial institutions, and, most damningly, Sir Jasper's private ledger, a leather-bound volume whose pages told a story of systematic embezzlement. Holmes turned the pages with swift efficiency, his trained eye extracting the essential facts with remarkable speed. "Here we have it, Watson. Embezzlements smoothed over as fees for extraordinary services. Loans supposedly secured against estate assets, but in fact diverted to Vale's private accounts. Payments to suppliers inflated by 20%, with the excess going into Vale's pocket. The man has bled this estate for years, probably since Sir Jasper's health began to fail, and he became less attentive to details." He turned to a section near the end of the ledger, where several loose papers had been tucked. One of these he drew out and unfolded carefully. "And here, Watson, is the coup de grâce, an unsigned codicil to Sir Jasper's will. Read it." I took the document and scanned it quickly. My blood ran cold as I grasped its implications. The codicil proposed to place Lady Eveline under temporary fiduciary guardianship due to concerns regarding her mental stability and capacity to manage complex financial affairs. The proposed guardian was, naturally, Mr. Orrin Vale, solicitor, who has faithfully served this estate for 20 years and possesses the knowledge and discretion necessary to preserve its integrity. "But this is monstrous," I exclaimed. "It would give Vale complete control of the estate while Lady Eveline lived, and upon her death the estate would pass to Lionel, who is both controllable and grateful for anyone who keeps the creditors at bay. Vale would continue as estate manager indefinitely, free to plunder as he pleased. But you notice, Watson, that the codicil is unsigned. Why? I considered. Because Sir Jasper died before he could be induced to sign it? Or perhaps he refused? The latter, I think. I suspect Vale presented this document for signature, perhaps claiming it was merely a formality of estate planning. But Sir Jasper, difficult man though he was, must have seen through the scheme. He refused to sign, and shortly thereafter he died. Not of a failing heart, Watson, but of prussic acid administered in his nightly laudanum. Holmes carefully returned the documents to the box, but not before using a small camera he had brought from our chambers to photograph several key pages. He then produced a stick of sealing wax and a candle, carefully warming the wax and taking an impression of the box's original seal. "We replace everything exactly as we found it," he explained. "Vale must not know that we have discovered his cache. When he comes to check it, as I believe he will, probably tonight, he must find everything undisturbed. But we will have our evidence, Watson. Between these photographs and our own testimony regarding the prussic acid traces, we will have sufficient proof to hang him." We replaced the box, sealed the cavity, and rehung the portrait with meticulous care. When we had finished, no sign remained of our investigation, save for the photographs tucked securely in Holmes's pocket. As evening approached, Holmes announced that he wished to conduct what he termed a demonstration. He invited the entire household to gather in the Red Chamber at 8 o'clock, claiming he could prove the supernatural manifestations to be nothing more than theatrical trickery. Mr. Vale arrived promptly, dressed for dinner, his walking stick in hand. He wore an expression of tolerant amusement, like a sophisticated adult indulging a child's belief in fairy tales. "You are fond of demonstrations, Mr. Holmes?" he inquired, settling himself in the chair Holmes had positioned by the window. "I confess I share that predilection. The law, after all, is nothing but demonstration, the methodical proving of facts before witnesses." "Just so," Holmes agreed, "and I shall demonstrate, in the manner of facts, how these manifestations were achieved. Observe, ladies and gentlemen, the mysterious, diabolical hand." With a theatrical gesture that would have done credit to a stage magician, Holmes darkened the room by drawing the heavy curtains. He had earlier positioned a small spirit lamp upon the table, and this he now lit. From beneath the window-sill he drew a thin wire. I recognized it as one he had brought from London for this precise purpose, and touched its tip to a bit of phosphorus he had daubed upon the brass latch. The effect was immediate and eerie. The latch glowed with a pale greenish light that might indeed have suggested supernatural agency to a frightened observer. The assembled company gasped, and I heard Miss Whitfield whisper a prayer. "Thus your ghost, ladies and gentlemen," Holmes announced, allowing the phosphorus to burn out. "A simple chemical reaction. Nothing more. A match head or bit of phosphorus rubbed upon the latch, ignited from without by a heated wire. Mysterious only to those unfamiliar with elementary chemistry." He drew back the curtains, flooding the room once more with the grey twilight. From behind a fold in the drapery, he produced the boots we had discovered, the ones shod with donkey iron. "And here are the devil's hoofs, worn last night by a gentleman who should consult a surgeon about his weakened right knee. A gentleman who speaks with what the local farrier described as a churchy throat, formal, precise speech. A gentleman who carries a walking stick from Holborn and Sons of Conduit Street, a stick whose head unscrews to reveal a small compartment. A stick, in fact, rather like the one Mr. Vale holds at this very moment." The room had gone utterly still. Lady Eveline sat frozen in her chair, one hand pressed to her throat. Lionel Ashcroft leaned forward, his bleary eyes suddenly sharp with attention. Miss Whitfield watched with an expression of dawning comprehension. Vale himself remained perfectly composed, though I observed his knuckles whiten slightly where they gripped the head of his stick. "This is most ingenious, Mr. Holmes. Quite a performance. But I fear you are confusing theatrical reconstruction with evidence. I own such a stick, certainly. It is a common enough design. But I assure you, I have not been creeping about the countryside in improvised devil's hoofs. No, Holmes agreed, his voice dropping to a more dangerous register. You have been far too clever for that. You hired someone to do the creeping, while you maintained your visibility and respectability. But you did rather more than orchestrate ghost stories, Mr. Vale. You murdered Sir Jasper Ashcroft. The words fell into the silence, like stones into a well. I saw Lady Eveline sway in her chair, and Miss Whitfield moved quickly to support her. Holmes stepped closer to Vale, his grey eyes hard as flint. Sir Jasper was poisoned, dosed over several nights with prussic acid mixed into his laudanum. The drug's powerful scent masked the almond odour of the poison, and his known heart condition made the death appear natural. But it was murder, carefully planned and coolly executed by someone with access to his study and knowledge of chemistry. "This is fantasy," Vale said quietly, but I detected for the first time a note of uncertainty in his voice. "You have no proof of such an accusation." "Don't I?" Holmes moved to the dreadful portrait and with a gesture indicated it. "Behind this painting, Mr. Vale, lies a cavity. Within that cavity is a tin box marked V.A., and within that box are Sir Jasper's private accounts, showing years of systematic embezzlement. There is also an unsigned codicil to his will, a document that would have given you complete control of this estate had Sir Jasper been foolish enough to sign it." Vale's face had gone the colour of old parchment. You have no right. I have every right when murder has been done. When Sir Jasper refused to sign your codicil, you killed him. And then you set about driving his widow mad, or murdering her as well, so that the estate would pass to the pliable Lionel, who would gratefully keep you on as manager while you continued your theft. The theatrical manifestations were designed either to drive Lady Eveline away, or to establish her as mentally unstable, a woman whose nerves had been shattered by grief and isolation. And yesterday, you very nearly succeeded in poisoning her with that treated veil. Holmes produced from his pocket a small glass vial, stoppered and sealed. Even from a distance, I could see the faint amber liquid it contained. "This vial contains prussic acid, Mr. Vale. I found it yesterday, hidden in the hollow head of a walking stick. Your walking stick, which I examined while you were at dinner. Enough poison to kill a dozen people, carried about as casually as another man might carry smelling salts." The silence that followed was absolute. Vale sat motionless, his face a mask that revealed nothing. Then, slowly, he smiled. A terrible smile that held no humour, only a kind of bitter acknowledgement. "You are very clever, Mr. Holmes," he said, in that quiet, voided voice of a man who sees the walls closing in. "Quite brilliant, really, and you may well convince a jury. But you will not convince me that any of this was other than necessary. Sir Jasper was a tyrant, a man who—" He checked himself, seeming to realize that any justification he offered would only deepen his guilt. "We step where our clients command, Mr. Holmes." "We do not," Holmes returned, and his voice was cold enough to freeze. "We decline the commission, and we certainly do not commit murder to cover our thefts." There was a sound from the corridor, the heavy tread of boots. Holmes had, I realized, sent a message to the village constable that morning, and that worthy individual now appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 sturdy assistants. "Mr. Orrin Vale," Holmes said formally, "I accuse you of the murder of Sir Jasper Ashcroft and the attempted murder of Lady Eveline Ashcroft. Constable Briggs, you will take this man into custody." What followed was the grim procedural business of arrest, the reading of the charge, the application of handcuffs, the collection of evidence. Vale submitted to it all with that same terrible composure, as if he were observing legal proceedings in which he had only a distant interest. The full extent of his scheme emerged over the following hours as the constable's investigation proceeded and various witnesses were examined. The farrier, Reuben Tabb, was quickly located and, under the threat of prosecution as an accessory, confessed to having altered boots at a gentleman's request. He identified Vale as that gentleman without hesitation. Lionel Ashcroft, though culpable in his wilful blindness and his shameful eagerness to inherit, had done no more than drink and bluster and hope. He had not been party to any crime, though his debts and his resentment had provided Vale with the motive for keeping Sir Jasper's brother as a potential heir. As for Reverend Peck and his lamp-black-stained fingers, that mystery was resolved when the good man explained, with considerable embarrassment, that he had been attempting to improve the legibility of worn hymnals by tracing over the faded text with a mixture of lamp-black and water. Some of this substance had inadvertently transferred to several surfaces in the chapel, including the latch of the side door, thus contributing without intention to the general atmosphere of sinister activity. When Vale was led out the following morning to be transported to the county jail, the moor received him with its customary silence, that vast, levelling indifference that reduces all human drama to insignificance. I watched from the window as the police wagon rattled away across the grey landscape, carrying its prisoner toward whatever justice awaited him. And I reflected that in that moment the moor seemed almost to acknowledge the passage of evil, as if it had known all along that such a man would eventually cross its bounds in chains. Chapter 5. The Hand at the Window. The night that followed was one I shall not soon forget. Holmes had declared his intention to keep watch through the small hours, anticipating that Vale's accomplice, for he remained convinced such a person existed, might make one final attempt now that the principal villain had been exposed. Lady Eveline had retired to her chamber under Miss Whitfield's watchful care, but I could not shake the sense that the story was not yet complete, that some final act remained to be played. I had taken to my bed shortly after midnight, but sleep proved elusive. The house seemed alive with small sounds, the creak of settling timber, the whisper of wind through ancient chimneys, the soft percussion of rain that had begun to fall against the windows. I lay in the darkness, my service revolver on the nightstand beside me, and listened to the Manor's nocturnal symphony. It was perhaps 2 o'clock when I heard it, a sound so soft that it might have been imagination, yet distinct enough to bring me fully alert. A click, barely audible, followed by the faintest breath of movement. I rose at once, pulling on my dressing gown and taking up my pistol. In stockinged feet, I moved to the door and eased it open. The corridor was dark, save for the faint moonlight that penetrated the windows at either end. I stood motionless, allowing my eyes to adjust, straining every sense. Then I saw it, a pale oval hanging in the darkness further down the passage. It was the window of the Red Chamber, and behind the glass for the briefest of moments, I glimpsed a hand that glowed with that same eerie phosphorescence Holmes had demonstrated earlier. I ran toward the chamber, all caution abandoned. The door stood slightly ajar, and I flung it wide, my pistol raised. A figure in black, slight of build, moving with desperate speed, started from the window-sill, a length of wire clutched in one gloved hand. "Stand!" I cried, and my pistol spoke almost of its own volition. The shot went wide, striking the window casing and sending splinters flying. The figure dropped the wire, which sparked as it struck the brass latch, releasing that acrid stench of burning phosphorus. In that same instant, a second shape materialized from the corridor, smaller, lighter, but moving with surprising determination. It was Miss Whitfield, still in her nightdress, but with a heavy candlestick raised in both hands. She swung at the black-clad intruder, the blow missing by inches as the figure ducked and twisted towards the door. "Stop him!" Miss Whitfield cried, her voice high with fury and fear. "Don't let him escape." But the corridor had suddenly become crowded with bodies. Lionel Ashcroft blundered into me, his shirt open, his hair wild, reeking of spirits and sleep. He went to his knees with a curse, grasping at my dressing gown and babbling incoherently about burglars and murders. Over his shoulder, moving with that peculiar economy of motion that marked all his actions, came Sherlock Holmes. He was fully dressed. He had not, I realized, been to bed at all, and in one hand he held Mr. Vale's walking stick, unscrewed at the head to reveal its hollow core. In his other hand he held a small glass vial, stoppered with cork and sealed with wax. The black-clad figure made one more desperate attempt to reach the servants' stair, but two of the burlier footmen, roused by the commotion, blocked that avenue of escape. The intruder backed into the center of the red chamber, chest heaving, and I saw for the first time that beneath the dark cloak and concealing scarf was a face I recognized. It was Thomas Garrett, Vale's clerk, a colorless young man I had glimpsed briefly during our earlier investigations, so forgettable in appearance that I had dismissed him from consideration entirely. Now, stripped of his anonymity by circumstance, he looked very young and very frightened. "Mr. Garrett," Holmes said, his voice almost gentle, "I had rather expected you. Indeed, I have been waiting for you. Will you come quietly, or must we resort to further unpleasantness?" The fight seemed to drain from the young man all at once. His shoulders sagged, and he pulled the scarf from his face with trembling hands. "He said it would be simple," Garrett whispered. "He said no one would be hurt, that it was only to frighten the lady away. He said she was trying to destroy him, that she had gone mad with grief and was making impossible accusations. I believed him. I believed." His voice trailed away into silence. Holmes stepped forward and took him gently by the arm. "You believed your employer and benefactor, as a young clerk might reasonably do. But Mr. Vale is a murderer, Garrett, and he made you his accomplice. Now you will tell us everything, and perhaps the court will consider your cooperation when determining your sentence." By this time, the entire household had assembled. Lady Eveline, white-faced but composed, leaning upon Miss Whitfield's arm. The servants clustered in the doorway. Reverend Peck, who had arrived from the vicarage upon hearing the shot. Holmes directed them all to the parlour, and, with the authority he always assumed in such moments, proceeded to lay out the complete picture of the crime. Mr. Vale's scheme was both simple and diabolical, he began, pacing before the cold fireplace while we sat or stood in stunned attention. He had been embezzling from the Ashcroft estate for years, not spectacular amounts that might draw immediate attention, but steady sums that accumulated considerably over time. Sir Jasper, in his declining health, paid less attention to the accounts than he once had, and Vale took full advantage of this laxity. Holmes turned to face Lady Eveline directly. "But you, madam, proved less complacent than your husband. Upon assuming control of the estate, you began to ask questions. You requested detailed accountings. You noticed discrepancies. You threatened an independent audit. For Vale, this represented the end of a very comfortable arrangement, and, more immediately, the likelihood of criminal prosecution and professional ruin. His solution was to remove the obstacles. First, Sir Jasper himself, who had refused to sign a codicil that would have placed you under Vale's legal guardianship. The baronet was poisoned with prussic acid mixed into his laudanum, a substance whose distinctive almond scent was masked by the drug itself. The murder was made to appear natural, and indeed Dr. Cartwright had no reason to suspect otherwise, given Sir Jasper's known heart condition. Lady Eveline's hand went to her throat, and I saw tears spring to her eyes. Miss Whitfield put her arm around her mistress's shoulders and glared at Holmes as if he were somehow responsible for the pain his revelations caused. But Holmes continued relentlessly. With Sir Jasper dead, Vale turned his attention to you, Lady Eveline. His preferred outcome was that you would be driven away by fear, that the theatrical manifestations would so prey upon your nerves that you would flee Ashwood and never return, leaving the estate in the hands of Lionel Ashcroft, who could be easily managed. Failing that, you would be murdered as your husband had been, and the same result achieved. The campaign began with relatively harmless theatrics, footprints made by boots fitted with donkey shoes, mysterious scorch marks produced by phosphorus and heated wire. These were the work of Mr. Garrett here, acting on Vale's instructions and believing, or choosing to believe, that they were simply playing an elaborate prank to frighten a difficult woman. Holmes's grey eyes fixed upon the clerk, who stood between the two footmen with his head bowed. But Vale's intentions were far more sinister. The treated Vale was his work, a sophisticated murder weapon that would have appeared to be nothing more than a tragic accident. Lady Eveline, already distraught, collapsed while trying on her mourning attire. Her heart gave out, just as her husband's did. A tragic pattern in the family. That would have been the verdict, and no one would have questioned it. Holmes held up the vial he had taken from Vale's walking stick, letting the lamplight catch the amber liquid within. Prussic acid, gentlemen and ladies, enough to commit murder twice over, carried about as casually as another man might carry coin. Vale used it to poison Sir Jasper. He used it to treat Lady Eveline's Vale. And last night, I believe, he intended Mr. Garrett to use it again, perhaps in the water pitcher, perhaps mixed with the laudanum Dr. Cartwright has prescribed for Lady Eveline's nerves. One final, decisive stroke to end the matter before the audit could proceed. Garrett's head snapped up at this. No, I swear, I knew nothing of poison. He told me only to create the appearances, the footprints, the glowing hand. He said it was to convince Lady Eveline to leave voluntarily, to spare her the humiliation of being declared incompetent. I never meant to harm anyone. I never would have. His voice broke, and he covered his face with his hands. Perhaps you speak truth, Holmes said, though his tone remained sceptical. But you were his instrument nonetheless, and the law will judge you accordingly. When did you last see Mr. Vale? Garrett drew a shuddering breath. Yesterday afternoon, after his arrest. He sent word through a street boy, a sealed note telling me to complete the final performance tonight, that all would still be well if I followed his instructions precisely. He said the arrest was merely a temporary setback, that his solicitor in London would have him freed within days, and that I must carry on exactly as planned. He looked up at Holmes with red-rimmed eyes. I was afraid to disobey him. He has been like a father to me. My own parents died when I was 12, and Mr. Vale took me into his office, trained me, gave me a position. I owed him everything. You owed him loyalty, perhaps, Holmes replied, but not complicity in murder. That is a debt no man should pay, Mr. Garrett, regardless of past kindnesses. There was a long silence, broken at last by Lady Eveline herself. She had regained her composure, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I can never adequately express my gratitude. You have saved my life, exposed the man who murdered my husband, and freed me from a terror I was beginning to believe might be my own madness. What you have given me is not merely safety, but sanity. The knowledge that I was not imagining threats, that my fears had foundation, in fact. Holmes bowed over her hand. Madam, you have endured more than any woman should be asked to bear, but you have borne it with courage and dignity, and you have my profound respect. As for gratitude, it is sufficient reward to see justice done and innocence protected. The formalities of the law consumed much of the following day. Constable Briggs returned with a magistrate and a proper warrant, and Mr. Garrett was taken into custody, though with considerably more gentleness than had been shown to Vale. The clerk's testimony, Holmes assured me, would be crucial in securing Vale's conviction, and the young man's evident remorse might indeed win him some consideration from the bench. The tin box was retrieved from its hiding place behind the portrait, and its contents were examined by the magistrate with growing horror. The evidence of embezzlement was overwhelming. Years of false entries, inflated expenses, fictitious payments to non-existent creditors. Vale had stolen, by conservative estimate, more than £10,000 from the Ashcroft estate, and would likely have continued indefinitely had Lady Eveline not begun to ask inconvenient questions. The farrier, Reuben Tabb, was brought before the magistrate, and reluctantly confirmed his role in creating the devil's hoofs. He was admitted, been paid 5 sovereigns for the work, and told to speak of it to no one. The description he provided of his customer matched Vale in every particular, and when shown a photograph of the solicitor, Tabb identified him without hesitation. As for Lionel Ashcroft, his position was complicated but not criminal. He had hoped to inherit, that much was obvious, and he had been culpably blind to the machinations occurring around him. But hoping for an inheritance, however ungraciously, is not a crime, and his drunken self-absorption had actually served as a kind of innocence, preventing him from perceiving or participating in Vale's schemes. He is a fool, Holmes remarked to me privately, but not a villain. Let him inherit what remains of the estate after Vale's depredations are made good, and perhaps the responsibility will sober him. Or perhaps it won't. But that, Watson, is no longer our concern. Miss Whitfield, when the whole sorry tale had been told, wept not for herself, but for her mistress. That she should have suffered so, she said to me, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and all because she dared to be diligent, to ask questions, to protect what was hers by right. Is that not always the way of it, Dr. Watson? The good are punished for their virtue, while the wicked prosper until chance or providence intervenes. Or until Sherlock Holmes intervenes, I corrected gently. Which in this case amounted to much the same thing. By Lady Eveline's order, the dreadful portrait was removed to the attic, wrapped in cloth, and stored where it would not trouble her with its cruel jest. I was never her, she said quietly, as the footmen carried it away. I was never the devil's widow. I was merely a woman who married a difficult man and tried to honor his memory by protecting what he built. That they should have made me into a figure of superstition and fear, that hurts more than the attempts on my life, Mr. Holmes. They stole not just my husband and my peace, but my very identity. Then take it back, madam, Holmes replied. Let the portrait rot in darkness, and let yourself walk in the light. You have proven yourself a woman of remarkable fortitude. Let that be your identity henceforth. On our final morning at Ashwood Manor, the weather broke at last. The grey skies that had oppressed us since our arrival parted to reveal a pale autumn sun, and the moor, which had seemed so threatening and desolate, showed itself in softer colours. The purple of late heather, the gold of dying bracken, the silver of morning dew upon the grass. It was as if the land itself acknowledged that some darkness had been lifted, some wrong set right. Lady Eveline saw us off herself, standing in the drive with Miss Whitfield beside her. Both women looked somehow lighter, as if a weight had been removed from their shoulders, which indeed it had. "Where will you go from here?" I asked Lady Eveline as we made our farewells. "To London, I think." "For a time," she replied. "I shall hire a new solicitor, one whose reputation is beyond reproach, and set the estate's affairs in order. Then perhaps I shall travel. I have never been to the continent, Dr. Watson, and I find myself suddenly possessed of both means and opportunity. It seems foolish to waste them." "Not foolish at all," I assured her. "You have earned your freedom, Lady Eveline. Use it well." The train journey back to London was a quiet one. Holmes occupied himself with the newspapers, though I suspected he was not truly reading them. He had that abstracted air that came upon him after a case was concluded, as if his mind, having been wound to such a pitch of activity, now struggled to slow its racing momentum. It was not until we were well past Exeter that he spoke at length. "You know, Watson, there is a peculiar satisfaction in cases such as this one, cases where the rational triumphs over the supernatural, where fear is revealed to have human dimensions after all. The world is strange enough without inventing devils to populate it. We have quite sufficient monsters in our own species." Vale certainly proved that, I agreed. A respected professional, a man trusted by his clients, and beneath it all, a cold-blooded killer. And yet not without his own twisted logic, Holmes mused. In his mind, I suspect, he had convinced himself that Sir Jasper's refusal to sign that codicil was an act of ingratitude, that Lady Eveline's questions were attacks upon his honour, that the money he stole was somehow owed to him for years of faithful service. The criminal mind, Watson, is endlessly resourceful in its rationalizations. He folded his newspaper and turned to gaze out at the passing countryside. Fields giving way gradually to villages, villages to suburbs, suburbs at last to the smoke and press of London itself. But there is justice in the end. Not always, perhaps not even often, but sometimes. And that sometimes must be enough to sustain us. We reached Paddington Station as the autumn dusk was falling, and within the hour we were back in our familiar Baker Street lodgings, that comfortable chaos of books and chemistry apparatus and tobacco-stained walls that represented home to both of us. Mrs. Hudson welcomed us with the news that no fewer than 3 potential clients had called during our absence, and that several telegrams awaited Holmes's attention. But my friend waved them all aside. "Tomorrow, Mrs. Hudson. Tonight, Dr. Watson and I shall simply enjoy the knowledge that justice has been served, that a murderer will face his reckoning, and that a good woman has been freed from an intolerable persecution." As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on all that had transpired at Ashwood Manor. We had arrived to find a household in the grip of supernatural terror, and we departed, leaving it restored to the realm of the natural and comprehensible. A woman had been saved, a murder avenged, and a villain unmasked. It was, I thought, precisely the sort of adventure that had drawn me to Sherlock Holmes in the first place. That peculiar combination of Gothic atmosphere and cold logic, of ancient shadows and modern scientific method. And it occurred to me that this case, more than many others, illustrated the essential character of my friend's genius, his ability to stand unmoved in the presence of apparent impossibility, to strip away the theatrical dressing and to reveal the human heart of darkness that beat beneath. I rose one final time and went to my writing desk, where I kept my casebooks and journals. Taking up my pen, I began to set down the first notes of what would become this narrative, beginning with those words that had launched the adventure. The morning had dawned thin and grey, as if London had been sketched rather than painted, when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. For I knew, even then, that this was a tale worth preserving, not merely for its mystery and resolution, but for what it revealed about the nature of fear itself, and about the power of human reason to penetrate even the darkest of deceptions. From across the sitting-room came the sound of Holmes's violin, a slow, melancholy air that seemed to speak of moors and widows and shadows laid to rest. I smiled and continued writing, knowing that whatever adventures the future held, whatever mysteries might darken our door, we would face them as we had faced this one, with courage, with logic, and with an absolute refusal to credit the impossible until the possible had been exhaustively eliminated. The Devil's Widow was free at last, and London slept soundly beneath its blanket of autumn fog, secure in the knowledge that somewhere in its midst, in a comfortable room at 221B Baker Street, vigilance kept watch against those devils that walked not on cloven feet, but on perfectly ordinary human ones. And sometimes, perhaps more often than we dare admit, that is precisely where the greatest dangers lie. Not in the realm of the supernatural, but in the cold, calculating malice of men who wear respectable faces and keep their venom hidden in hollow walking sticks and false smiles. Holmes's final words to me that evening, spoken just before he retired to his own chamber, have remained with me ever since. "The devil, Watson, has small hands in England. They are white, manicured, and accustomed to handling legal documents. Remember that, my friend, and you will never be deceived by theatrical hoofprints or glowing hands. The monsters we need fear are those who sit across from us at the dinner table and call themselves gentlemen." I had no answer to give him, for none was needed. The case was closed, justice had been served, and the morning would bring new challenges, new mysteries, new opportunities to prove once again that reason and observation could triumph over superstition and fear. As I extinguished my lamp and settled into sleep, the last thought that crossed my mind was this: that somewhere on the wild moors of Devonshire, Ashwood Manor stood quiet beneath the stars, its rooms no longer haunted by false devils, its mistress no longer terrorized by human malice disguised as supernatural vengeance. And that, I reflected with considerable satisfaction, was perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Not how evil was done, but how it could be undone by two men, a magnifying glass, and an unwavering faith in the power of the human intellect to illuminate even the darkest corners of human depravity. The case of the Devil's Widow was ended, but the work of Sherlock Holmes, the endless, necessary work of bringing light to shadow and truth to deception, would continue as long as crime persisted in taking human form and wearing human faces. And so, with that comforting certainty, I slept. And so ended the matter of the Devil's Widow, where fear was unmasked and reason stood triumphant over shadows. For myself, I confess the memory lingers, like the echo of a storm long past. If this tale captured you, I invite you to subscribe for more untold cases of Sherlock Holmes and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Until the next case, keep your lamp burning and beware the fog.